So, good morning, everybody, and welcome back. Today, we're going to carry on our discussion about, we've been talking about cells, and what we're doing is we're slowly building up an organism. We talked about the molecules that are used to make biomolecules. We took those molecules and put them together to form cells. Now we're going to start taking the cells and allowing the cells to associate with one another the way that they do in multicellular organisms like us. We take it up through various levels. Eventually, we're going to be talking about organs and various organ systems and how they work. For today's class, we're going to be talking about tissues and membranes. That is the lowest level of organization of cells, and we're going to see that there are various ways in which cells join together and the way that they form different tissues. So the first thing to realize, of course, is that there are many different kinds of cell in the body, in any organism. And when we look at these cells, we can actually join them, group them by their structure and also by the sorts of function that they perform. And we recognize here 4 major types of tissue. When we group a similar group of cells together like that, we refer to that as a tissue. And there are 4 main groups. These are the epithelial tissues. In general, these are the tissues of covering, the skin, the mucous membranes inside your mouth, inside your gut, etc. And then also, very importantly, all of the glandular tissue in the body is derived from epithelial tissues. So that's going to be our first group, the epithelial tissues. The second group that we'll talk about are the connective tissues. And these are tissues which do literally connect. They connect one part of the body to another, but they're also tissues which are often protective. You'll often see connective tissues used to protect organs, to surround them and protect them. So we recognize there are 3 types of connective tissue. The first is loose connective tissue. Surprisingly enough, blood is a connective tissue. It connects all of the body to all the rest of the body. Blood is a connective tissue. Dense connective tissues are tissues like bone and cartilage. And then there's a group of specialized connective tissues, the tendons and the ligaments, these which are the main ones that we will refer to. The third group are a highly specialized group of tissues called the muscle tissues. There are various kinds of muscle tissue. Instinctively, we think we understand something about muscle because it's so familiar to us in our own body. It makes up so much of the bulk of our body. And but there are actually 3 kinds of muscle tissue that we're going to talk about. The first is the heart muscle, which is cardiac muscle, and that is a very specialized kind of muscle. Then there's another kind of muscle called smooth muscle. Smooth muscle, we have no voluntary control over smooth muscle. It is controlled by an unconscious part of our nervous system, which we call the autonomic nervous system. The last kind of muscle is the one that you're probably most familiar with, and that is striated muscle. And that composes all our voluntary muscles, the muscles that we can contract at will. And that has its own special structure. The last group of tissues that we're going to talk about is the nervous tissue. And nervous tissue is very highly specialized, but the cells actually are really diverse. There are many kinds of tissues that comprise the nervous tissue. But in general, a general definition would be that nervous tissue is a cell composed of cells which are able to respond to stimuli, and they are able to transmit information. Their central ability is the ability to produce a nerve impulse. So they are responsible for control of the body and all of its aspects. In us, there's a really complex multicellular organism. Our nervous system is largely driven by the brain. In other animals, in simpler animals, it might not be the same. But for us, we will spend some time talking about the basic structure of nerves, and then we will have a close look at the nervous system, the brain, and all of the rest of the nerves. So we also need to get clear in our minds the concept of what a membrane is. And a membrane consists of at least 2 layers of tissue sandwiched together. So, and in actual fact, we mostly will see this in that group of tissues that we've already referred to, the epithelial tissue. So let's have a look at epithelial membranes. We're going to take epithelial tissue, epithelial cells. We'll see some of them first of all, and then we're going to organize them into membranes. The first kind of membrane is a mucous membrane. The mucous membranes tend to be rather thin membranes inside of your mouth. You can feel mucous membrane on the inside, and the name gives it away. They are membranes with specialized glandular cells in them, which secrete mucus, which secrete a fluid. And the mucous membranes, they line our respiratory system, they line our reproductive system, the intestine, all of those organs which have an internal cavity, they are lined by mucous membrane. The second type of epithelial membrane is one that people often forget about, but it's really important. These are the serous membranes. The serous membranes are double membranes with a space in between them, and that space is filled with fluid. And these membranes surround organs. For example, the heart is surrounded by a serous membrane called the pericardium around the heart. That's literally what it means. It's a serous membrane that surrounds the heart, and it's fluid filled. But they're also very important on the joints. They surround our joints, and they contain a fluid which lubricates the joint. The last epithelial membrane that we'll talk about is a thick, tough epithelial membrane, and that is the skin. And the skin actually comprises the largest organ of the body. Our skin is regarded as being a single organ, and it is composed of cutaneous membranes. There are different membranes layered in the cutaneous membranes to make up the whole body of the skin. We'll talk about that structure a bit later on. So let's have a look and see. There are actually 6 types of epithelial membrane. The first one, our earlier definition didn't really include this because we said it was a membrane was 2 cells or more. You can actually have a membrane with just 1 layer of cells, but and here they are shown. First of all, they're ones with a single layer of epithelial cells are called the simple epithelia. And the easiest one to think about, to visualize, is squamous epithelium. And that is typical like of the lining of your mouth. A very thin layer of cells. And if you were to look at them from top, you'd see that they were shaped often as hexagons all joined together. So this is from the side. Very thin, and in our mouths, extremely loose. And they're continually replaced. They're replaced by, from cells underneath, continually make their way up to form the membrane. And they're deliberately loose. This is one of the ways in which we control the amount of bacteria that are in our mouths. Bacteria settle on these cells, they grow for a certain time, and then the cell is shed. You can also rub them off very, very easily. With no damage, they're replaced very, very quickly. This is the second type of simple epithelium. This is cuboidal epithelium. Cuboidal because the cells are almost square. So let's have a look at the structure of the cell. Remind ourselves that around the outside, there's a cell membrane. Here is the nucleus, a large nucleus. And around the nucleus, underneath the membrane, is the cytoplasm. That is cuboidal epithelium. And we'll see really good examples of that, especially when we look at glands. The glands are often made up of cuboidal epithelium of one sort or another. This is columnar epithelium, obviously called columnar because it's long and looks like columns all stacked together like that. This would be very typical of, for instance, lining of our respiratory tract, those sort of places. And this is a specialized kind of columnar epithelium. Have a look at the top here. Can you see that little brush there? It looks like those are cilia. They're little beating hairs. They beat like this. And also embedded in this columnar epithelium, not shown here, there'll be mucus cells which produce a layer of mucus over the top here. And it's the job of those cells to waft that mucus in one direction. In our case, in our respiratory tract, it conducts the mucus upwards towards our throats. So it conducts mucus, a sheet of mucus, all the way from our lungs, all the way up to the top of the throat, where we swallow it. That's the usual fate of the mucus. We swallow it. We don't blow it out our noses. That arises, when you blow your nose, you're mostly blowing mucus that arises in your nasal passages and your sinuses. The mucus that is driven up your throat by these cilia is usually swallowed. So the epithelial membranes can become very complicated. They can become very complex. And when they do, we call them stratified. That is, they have more than one layer to them. And this is the best example, really. This is, you can see all of these cells stacked up like this. Again, it's still called squamous because most of the cells, if you look from the top, they'd be shaped like hexagon or polygons all joined together, and they tend to be flattened. Squamous actually means pavement. So these cells form like a pavement. And this, in fact, these here would be typical, for example, of our skin. A thick layer of these squamous cells all squished together. In the skin, these top cells here are not alive. They're still they're still part of the membrane, but they're no longer living. They've got a lot of a tough protein built into them called keratin. And that makes a protective layer. That is what gives skin its strength and its protective nature. This is more cuboidal epithelium, but here stratified cuboidal. Again, probably easiest seen in some glands. This is stratified columnar epithelium. And this would be very typical of the lining of the epithelial lining of the gut, of the stomach and the gut. And we'll see that in stomach and gut, some of these cells, some of these columnar cells will be specialized as glandular cells. They will be producing substances for release to the outside. Okay, so they've got three kinds: squamous, cuboidal, columnar, and those can be simple layer, or they can be stratified. They can be built up into many layers, depending on what organ you're talking about, depending on the function that this membrane has to perform. So here's some stratified columnar epithelium. Stratified because we have cells underneath here, as well as these big cells that we see here. This is also from the respiratory tract. And on the outside here, you can see that there are these fine hairs called the cilia, which under normal circumstances, if it was alive, would be beating, all of them beating in synchrony to move a sheet of mucus. Here's the mucus on the top. So this is the inside, probably, of the respiratory tract. Again, you can see the structure of the cell quite clearly. Cilia. Around the outside would be a cell membrane, and you can see the nucleus very, very clearly there for each cell. Each cell has one nucleus. And I should just add a little health note for you. People who smoke, one of the very first effects, it starts to occur very soon after you begin smoking. One of the first effects is that these cilia are damaged. In fact, they start to beat out of synchrony from the toxins in the cigarette smoke. And they eventually, if you smoke enough, you start to damage all of the columnar epithelium. You start to lose the ability to move this mucus up and away from your lungs in a healthy fashion. And that is why heavy smokers or people who've smoked for a very long time end up having to cough very vigorously to get all that, to get the mucus up out of their lungs. Their lungs no longer function properly because the cilia have been damaged. Give up smoking. Okay, so here's, remember, I also told you that epithelial tissues are also the major component of all the glands. Most glands are derived directly from epithelial tissue. Not all, but most glands are derived from epithelial tissue. And here is a very simple example. This is probably, I would think, salivary gland. And just have a look here. Can you see the circle of cells? You can see the nuclei there, all the way around. So we've got these square-shaped epithelial cells, and they're surrounding a space in there. So this would be part of a space inside the gland where the products of the gland are accumulated, and then they will be moved to the outside. And so this is cuboidal epithelium. And in this case, the cuboidal epithelium, often in this part of the gland, that cuboidal epithelium is highly modified to produce a product. The rest of the gland often is lined with cuboidal epithelium. In this case, if this is salivary gland, all of these, this will be a duct which leads ultimately to the outside, to the mouth, for saliva to be expressed. So these glandular tissues are extremely complex and very, very highly specialized. And they consist of this mixture of cuboidal cells, which are just ordinary, and then cuboidal cells, which have been highly modified to be secretory cells. So they are secretory epithelial cells. This is just a simple structure of such a gland. Here's the cuboidal epithelium just lining outside, and then lining this duct here. The duct is a tube leading to the outside. And then at the end of the duct is the area where the secretion actually takes place. And this will be a mixture of cuboidal and a glandular epithelium. And the glandular cells are modified cuboidal cells, which are specialized to produce a particular product. And that product is accumulated here. This is called the lumen, L-U-M-E-N, the lumen of the gland. And then it is expressed to the outside through this duct. So typically in this sort of gland with this sort of structure, produce the major body fluids, for example, sweat, milk, oil. For instance, there are oil glands on our skin associated usually with the hair that produce oil, which is released onto the surface of the skin. There are other glands which produce hormones, which I'll talk about in a minute. And the last really important function of these glandular tissues is to produce enzymes. And we'll encounter some, just a brief introduction to some of them today. For example, the digestive enzymes. I'll show you 3 different digestive enzymes. What product they produce depends on the specialization of these cells, on what their fate is. And remember what I told you before, a cell acquires its specialization because it silences some genes and it expresses other genes on the DNA. These are highly specialized cells producing these products. So here's a typical, again, that's just the same kind of diagram. Here's the secretory tissues here. Here's the duct here. And here's the lumen here. And this part here may still be another duct. The duct may be extensively branched, joining together to one or more major outlets for the gland. Here's an actual section of the gland. I think that this is is in the stomach. And you can see here, look, these cells here are the secretory cells. Here's the duct here, and it's opening actually to the outside there directly. Okay, and these large units here are not the nuclei. The nuclei are down below. Can you see there? The nuclei are all down below here. These here are big vacuoles. They are units inside the cell containing the product that that cell is producing. If I'm right, and this is stomach cell, this would be hydrochloric acid that they are producing to release to the outside into the stomach itself. So the cell will, these secretory cells will accumulate amounts of this, and then they will move it to the outside and release it. So here, just to show you, these glands are actually in some ways almost connected with one another, because these are all glands associated with the digestive tract. The first set of glands, very easy for us to visualize in our minds, because these are the salivary glands. If you feel underneath here, you feel carefully there, you can feel the major salivary glands there, called the parotids there. And there are numerous other salivary glands as well, all of which feed into your mouth. Now, the saliva is extremely important for various reasons. First of all, it flushes the mouth continually and helps to keep the bacterial population low. The second thing is that saliva is very important in binding food together into a unit which can be easily swallowed. And as part of the saliva is an important digestive fluid. The third thing about it is that it produces an enzyme. The salivary glands produce an enzyme. It's called amylase. You don't need to remember the product, but just remember that it digests starch. It breaks starch down into simple sugar units. Remember, we said that starch is made up of glucose units all joined together into a long chain, and that's the responsibility of this enzyme produced by the salivary glands, amylase. Amylase actually breaks down starch into simpler sugars. So you swallow that, you chew, that's why you should chew your food well. It's the first stage of digestion. If you want to do a little experiment, take some ordinary white bread and put it in your mouth and chew it. Make note of the taste. When you first put the bread in your mouth, it has a starchy feel and flavor to it. Keep on chewing it. Chew it, 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 chew it for minutes, much longer than you normally would. And you'll perceptibly realize that it's changing flavor. It's actually becoming sweet. And that is what's happening. The starch is being in the bread, is being broken down to sugars, and you can taste them. Swallow that, and it goes to your stomach. Amazingly enough, the stomach, as I've just shown you, has glands in it which produce a very strong acid, and that is hydrochloric acid. So remember, I did refer once before to the pH scale, the scale of acidity or alkalinity. If a substance is acid, it has a low pH. If it's alkaline, it has a high pH. And if you look at the pH of stomach acid, it is very, very low. The pH is about 1 to 2, extremely, extremely strong acid. And it's an amazing thing that this doesn't actually damage the tissues of the stomach. Instead, it's very important that the pH be low, because we also secrete in the stomach an enzyme, and it's called pepsin. It actually comes out as this pepsinogen, but in the low pH of the stomach, it becomes active, and it's called pepsin. And it's one of the very, very powerful enzyme, which begins the breakdown of proteins that you've eaten. It begins to break them down into smaller units. And the stomach is actually protected. The rest of the epithelial tissues in the stomach are protected by the strong layer of mucus. that isolates, it keeps the hydrochloric acid away from those tissues so that they don't get damaged by the acid. So the stomach produces both hydrochloric acid and it produces an enzyme called pepsin. So once that first part of digestion is finished in your stomach, it gets passed down into your small intestine, and it immediately meets excretions from the organ called the pancreas. And the pancreas is a very complex organ, and it secretes many different substances. The two that we are going to pay attention to, first of all, it secretes bicarbonate, and bicarbonate is alkali, and it neutralizes the acid from the stomach. That's as soon as it leaves the stomach, the hydrochloric acid is neutralized by pancreatic juices. But in addition, the second set of substances that the pancreas produces it produces many, many different enzymes, very important, very powerful digestive enzymes. And for the moment, you don't really need to remember the names. Just remember that these are able to digest proteins, fats, and starches. We will, if you want to memorize them now, trypsin, lipase, amylase. We will be discussing the function of the pancreas later on when we talk about digestion. But just remember, they digest these three things: proteins, triglycerides, fats, lipids, and starches. So this is an amazing thing, because realize that all of these, saliva, gastric juice, pancreatic juice, these are all secreted by basically the same kind of tissue, the same kind of membrane, which is epithelial. And it's mostly cuboidal, but it is highly modified, and they're highly specialized to produce these really esoteric products. So this is just a brief summary for you to help you understand and to move us on to our next topic. First of all, let's think of epithelial tissues. First of all, major importance, the epithelial tissues which cover and line, so that our skin covering and then lining the interior organs, etc., etc., etc. So they are tissues of covering, but also they contain secretory cells, and they may be specialized by taking bundles of those cells and enclosing them into glands. So the glands are derived from epithelia, but they differ from just the ordinary epithelial membranes. Epithelial membranes may have secretory cells in them without being glands, but a gland is a separate entity where the secretory cells actually predominate, and they have that distinct structure of the secretory cells, the lumen, and a duct of some sort. Sorry, I will clarify that in a second. That's the kind of gland that we've talked about so far, with those with a bundle of secretory cells, a lumen in the middle, and then a duct. There's one other kind of gland which we have not yet talked about. The glands that we talked about here, these kind of glands with the secretory cells, lumen, and then the duct to the outside, have a special name. They are called the exocrine glands. That means their product goes to the outside. So it's always going to a space. We have many exocrine glands in our skin, which secrete sweat, for example, and lipid oils. Those are voided to the skin surface. We have many, many exocrine glands in the digestive system. All of their products are secreted out. Their outside is the interior of the gut. They are secreted into the interior of the gut. But there are another group of glands also derived, usually, not always, but usually from epithelial tissues. And these are called the endocrine glands. Endocrine glands have no lumen or duct. They are highly specialized groups of cells which usually produce hormones. And the hormones are actually secreted not into a duct, not into a system like that, of tubes or whatever, but secreted into the blood system. They release their hormones, they release the products of the secretory cells are released into the fluid surrounding the cell. That's we call the interstitial fluid. It's the fluids which bathe all of our cells and our organs. And the hormones, the products of these endocrine glands are secreted into that and are taken up by the blood to be conducted around the body. So here's the distinction. This is an exocrine gland. This is a typical exocrine gland. Here, as you see, it's got a complex duct system, but that eventually leads to an outside, either to the skin surface for some of them, maybe to the lumen of the gut or whatever. They have a product. They have a liquid product which is released in volume to the outside. This is an endocrine gland. This gland does not have a duct system. Instead, the blood system runs through the endocrine gland. The cells secrete their product into the fluids surrounding the cell, and that becomes incorporated into the circulatory system, and the blood system actually then conducts the hormone away. This is almost the definition of a hormone. It is a substance secreted somewhere which has its action remote from the place where it was secreted. So these are the endocrine glands. And I'm just going to, now we will do this again, but it's a good idea to get these, some familiarity with the different endocrine glands. There are many different endocrine glands in human beings or in complex animals. I'll just give you the names and like a basic function from we will hear more about them, especially when we talk about human reproduction. Okay. So first of all, this gland here is a very small gland. This is a gland which is derived from nervous tissue, and it is called the hypothalamus. And it sits right in the middle of your brain. There. The hypothalamus is often called the conductor because the hypothalamus exerts control over so many different body systems. And a lot of the control it exerts is done through this gland here, which I'm sure you've heard about. It's the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland, under control of the hypothalamus, produces many, many hormones, which have really drastic effects on the body. I just mentioned two groups, for example. The one group would be the pituitary hormones. The growth hormones, which regulate growth of the body. The second would be all of those pituitary hormones, which control the sex hormones, which control reproduction. This is an interesting little gland here called the pineal. I'll just tell you this for interest. You don't need to remember much about the pineal. What I do want you to remember is the pineal is responsible for producing melatonin. And you've probably heard of that. Melatonin is concerned with regulating our sense of day and night. So the pineal, it releases it during the day. It doesn't release much melatonin. After nightfall, it begins to produce more and more melatonin, and that's one of the things which induces sleep. So just remember that. It produces melatonin, and that's concerned with regulating our biorhythm, our sense of day and night. But I'll tell you a couple of interesting things about the pineal. The pineal actually, when you look at it, when you section it and look at it, it looks like a little eye. It has almost what look like retinal tissue and various other features, which make us believe that it was actually derived from an organ, something like an eye. Now, that may sound extraordinary to you, but remember that some animals actually do have a third eye. There are reptiles which have a third eye on top of their head. It's not in some of them, they can see a shadow. They can sense movement. They can't form an image, but its most important function is, again, regulation of the rhythms, of the biorhythms. So maybe it would be useful to have an eye, a third eye, who knows? But in any case, that's just for interest's sake. There is some association between the pineal and the structure of the eye. Pineal actually is usually only active until you're in your 30s. And after that, it actually ceases activity. We don't quite know, because you still have a good sense of biorhythm and everything else. We don't quite know what takes over the function. But there are other systems which take over the function of regulating biorhythm. But after the age of, in your 30s, the pineal ceases to act and it becomes calcified as a little dot. On an X-ray, the X-ray technicians often use the pineal to center, as to orient themselves on an X-ray, because it appears as a little calcified dot. The thyroid gland here, you can, if you feel your Adam's apple, just underneath, you won't be able to feel the thyroid, but it lies just underneath you there. And the thyroid is major concern is regulation of metabolism. Then associated with the thyroid, but a different gland, although it lies with the thyroid, these are different glands, entirely different function. These are the parathyroids, small glands that lie closely applied to the thyroid. That's why they're called parathyroid. But they are responsible for calcium regulation, for calcium metabolism in the body. Next, this is a very, very important gland of the immune system. And this is the thymus. It lies right behind your breastbone here. And it's another of these glands which ceases most of its activity as we age. As you get into your 40s or so, the thymus will have practically disappeared. But in the earlier years, it is extremely important in the immune system. This doesn't mean to say that this loss of the thymus weakens your immune system. It is just part of the development of the immune. That's how the immune system develops. The adrenal glands here, they lie on top of the kidneys, and they're a very complex gland. I won't just go into the discussion. We'll talk about them later on. But their best known effect is if you get a fright. Okay, the adrenal glands produce a burst of the hormone adrenaline, epinephrine, and that causes the heart to race, causes your blood pressure to go up, causes your muscles to become very active. In other words, it induces the fight or flight response. It gets your body ready to either run away from danger or to fight it. We'll talk about the adrenal glands in some detail. The kidney, believe it or not, its major responsibility is excretion. It's production of urine with the waste products in the urine. But the kidney is actually also an endocrine gland. It produces some very important hormones, particularly which regulate blood pressure. The pancreas is a very, very, very complex organ. And I remember I talked about it a minute ago as being an exocrine gland, as having exocrine glands. It does. It has exocrine glands which produce exocrine fluids, especially digestive fluids. But the pancreas also produces hormones, and the most important one you will have heard of, and that is insulin. And insulin is a hormone which regulates the concentration of glucose in your blood. it is released in response to high glucose levels, and it reduces the levels of glucose in your blood. The way it does that, we will talk about much later. The next group of endocrine glands are the sex glands, and they're the ones you'll know well, that the ovary and the testis are both exocrine glands. They produce this major sex hormones. And but you may not know that the uterus is also an endocrine gland, is also an endocrine gland. It also produces hormones, which we will hear a lot about when we talk about human reproduction. Okay, so those are the endocrine glands. What I'd like you to do is to make sure that you make a list of these, and all you need to do is put down the major function, okay? So that you learn these glands, know where they are, recognize them, and then also be able to tell me one major function of the gland. Okay, here's some more exocrine glands, just very typically. This could be virtually anything. It could be salivary gland, it could be mammary gland producing milk, sweat glands, they all have a structure similar to this. Here are the secretory the cells derived from cuboidal epithelium. And you can see, do you remember I told you that the endoplasmic reticulum, especially the rough endoplasmic reticulum, is responsible for producing substances like proteins and things like that. And this is exactly what is happening here. The endoplasmic reticulum fills the cell because the cell is a factory. These are glandular cells. That is their dedicated function, is to produce a product, and they're filled with the machinery to do it. Secreted here into the lumen, and then it is expressed through the ducts of the exocrine gland. Let's just have a look. Here's the skin. And here are two examples of exocrine glands in the skin. The first, the sweat glands. Here they are here. And they have a duct which leads to the outside. They not only produce an aqueous solution of salts, there are various other substances in sweat which are really important, and especially the sweat has an antibacterial activity. These are sebaceous glands, and the sebaceous glands are associated with hair, and they release lipids and oils. And so these are the sebaceous glands, especially when we're teenagers. They're the bane of our life because they tend to overproduce oils, and they tend to clog this pore up and form a pimple. And that's the origin of acne. So, but that is simply a response to hormonal changes that these sebaceous glands overproduce. Acne, these things are nothing to do with having dirty skin or anything like that. It's from a different process entirely. But I do want to point out how complex this layer, these epithelial layers are here. Here is the actual skin. These are all, this here is all epithelial tissue, but it's organized in a very complex fashion. And so we'll talk about that in much more detail when we talk about this. We'll have a section where we talk just about the skin. And just point out that right here, this here is a layer of cells which divide very rapidly to produce that stratified structure of the epidermis. The outside part is called the epidermis. And it is layers of cells. They die as they reach the surface and are heavily keratinized. They have keratin in. It's the same protein that makes hair. So the outside layer is tough and protective. We'll talk about the skin and its the hair and all of these structures again later on. So I just wanted today finish by talking about the connective tissues. And the connective, this is our second type of tissue. The Connective tissues are tissues which are specialized to store substances, to support organs, and to connect organ systems. Storage function is easily shown. For example, fat tissue is a connective tissue, and here it is here. This is an individual cell here. So there's its nucleus. Its cytoplasm is that thin layer of stained cytoplasm around there. And in the middle here, you see there's this clear space. That is fat, or lipid sometimes. And that's a storage, that is a vacuole. Now, vacuoles are not very common in animal tissue. They're much more common in plant tissue. But here is a vacuole. It's a fat vacuole. And each of these is a fat cell. Fat is our long-term energy storage. Fat is usually laid down only when times are really rich and the body can afford to take extra energy and matter and turn it into this very rich source of energy, but it is very, very stable. It's quite difficult to access this, and you only access it when times become really rough. So most animals will build up fat, like in rich times when food is easily available, etc., etc., and store it, and they will not be able to metabolically access that until they are really starving. And then the fat begins to get broken down. It's a long-term protective storage. So this tissue that keeps the fat is called adipose tissue. Adipose tissue, by the way, can also be used as a protective mechanism. For example, on top of the kidneys, there are two big fat bodies that sit on top of the kidneys, and that's purely protective to protect the kidneys. Okay, here's another kind of connective tissue, and this is dense, fibrous connective tissue. And these are the tendons and the ligaments. Tendons and ligaments are extremely strong. They are largely proteinaceous, and they consist of very, very, very strong protein. This is laid down by specialized cells. And the distinction between tendons and ligaments is that a tendon connects a muscle to bone. So here, for example, is skeletal muscle, and that would be typical of your biceps. And it is connected to the bone here by very strong tendons that insert onto the bone. They're very tightly tied to the bone. Tendons are living tissue. This is not a dead rope connecting the muscle. It's a living tissue that connects the muscle to the bone. Ligaments are very similar cellular makeup. They look very similar under the microscope. But ligaments are short, and they connect bone to bone. So all of these here are ligaments. They all connecting bone to bone. And you'll realize that they're tremendously important because they stabilize our joints. They make our joints very, very strong. And so when we look at the tendons and ligaments under the microscope, this is what we see. We see these long cells. Here are the nuclei here. And this wavy thing here, this is a living cell, but it's full of these extremely strong proteins that give it its strength. And you can, I don't think I need to go through the blood vessels. It has blood vessels and everything running through it, nerves and all sorts of things as well. What I will ask you to remember is that the most important protein here in ligaments and tendons is, here's the name here, collagen. That is a name that you must remember, collagen. In ligaments and tendons, it's mostly collagen. We'll encounter it again in a minute. And the whole cell filled with its fiber is called a fascicle, F-A-S-C-I-C-L-E, fascicle. Okay. So our next dense connective tissue, this may surprise you, but is bone. Bone is a connective tissue, and bone is very, very much a living tissue. Although you may be tempted, because where do we see bones? We see them in skeletons. You may be tempted to think of bone as being a dead thing. It's not. It's very much alive. And here is a cross section, a microscopic cross section here. And these dark areas here, there are actually hollows running through the bone tissue, and these are where blood vessels are running. Bone is a living tissue. It has to be supplied with oxygen. It has to be supplied with nutrients, and it has to have all its waste matter, carbon dioxide and everything else taken away for the cells to function properly. So it has its own blood system running through it. The cells of the bone cells themselves are here. You see these little dark streaks here. They have a particular structure. There's they have a cell body in the middle, but if you look very carefully, you can see these little thin lines running away. You'll see in a minute, these are actually part of the cell. And those lines are extending all this, what in this preparation here is a yellowish color, is a mixture. It's a mixture of protein like collagen, and it's embedded with calcium phosphate. And that is what gives bone its hardness. But you must remember, even if I was to take away all the calcium phosphate, I would still be left with what looked like a bone. There is a matrix to the bone, a skeleton to the bone itself, which is made of proteins like collagen, in which all of these living bone cells are embedded. And the bone cells actually secrete this calcium phosphate that make up the hardness, the hard part of the bone. So have a look here. That canal running down the middle is called a Haversian canal, and that's named after someone. And the whole one unit here, have a look here, and you'll see this there. There's one unit, there's another unit there. Here's another one here boxed for you. That is called a Haversian system. And these here are the bone cells here, these little blobs there. And they have these extensions running away from them. And all of that calcium phosphate is laid down by those in between them. So first of all, these are embedded in this protein matrix. And then in addition to that, these cells will secrete calcium phosphate. They don't, we'll talk about how bone functions a bit later on when we talk about the skeleton, but I want to tell you that bone changes shape the whole time. Bone grows, but it can also shrink. It can, a bone can actually be bent with time. And that is because there are various kinds of cells in the bone. There are cells which build up bone, but there are also cells which break down bone. So the shape of bone can be changed. And one of the things which changes it is continual pressure in one direction, either constant or through constant usage. So bones change shape, for example, depending on your livelihood, depending on what you do. If you tend to use one arm more than the other, the bones of that arm change relative to the other arm. If you repeat an action, an activity over and over and over again, the bones will change shape to accommodate the pressures put on them by that activity. So just remember, bone is a living tissue. I'll just finish off by talking about cartilage. And this is another dense connective tissue. And cartilage provides support to organs. It can be structural, and it also cushions. So, for example, the ends of all our bones are capped with cartilage, and cartilage there is provides a smooth surface for the joints to articulate one against the other. So I'll just quickly, we'll talk about this a little bit more when we talk about the skeleton, but I'll just show you the structural functions. For example, in your ear, it provides the structure to your ear and to your nose. When we say people break their nose, what we usually talk about is actually the cartilage, not the bone. The bone is up here. You can break the bone, nasal bone, but if people break their nose, they usually smash the cartilage. So the structure of your nose is structural. Think about the respiratory tract. All of the respiratory tract, the structure it has its own like skeleton of cartilage, which keeps the respiratory tract open. So those are all structural. Then at the ends of the bones, in all of the joints, all given their smoothness and protected by a layer of cartilage. And then cartilage can actually join bone to bone. For example, there are cartilage, there are lengths of cartilage which join the sternum, the breastbone, to some of the ribs. So there can also be a joining. There's various types of cartilage. And it's somewhat similar to tendons and ligaments in that it does have collagen. It is partly composed of collagen, but it has another protein associated with it called chondroitin. Collagen and chondroitin are typical of cartilage, and this is how it's structured. You can see here. This is like a matrix. This is not living in a way. It's secreted by these cells here. These are the actual cartilage cells, and they secrete this thick matrix. Very strong. It is very strong to compression. It can be torn, but it will take a tremendous amount of pressure without deforming. That is why it's useful to cap the ends of bones where a lot of pressure is exerted. So these here are the cells of the cartilage, and they have a special name. They're called chondrocytes. They're there, and they would secrete everything that you see around them. Okay, and I think we'll leave it there for today, and we'll continue this discussion at our next class.